Ingrid has exceptional knowledge of web technologies and social networking and has developed multimedia content and curriculum for world-class interactive experiences. She is currently on faculty at Howard University as an assistant professor of new media in the Department of Journalism. She began working in interactive media in 1985 as a member of the New York Times videotext project. She has worked online since 2001, most recently as a web strategist for heartandsoul.com. She has also worked as a senior programming manager for AOL's Black Voices and as editor-in-chief at essence.com. Previously, Ingrid worked as a managing editor for startup magazines BET Weekend and Savoy. In addition, she has worked for several newspapers, including the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Times-Herald Record, and the Poughkeepsie Journal. I think I have massacred the name.
Yeah, no, that's pretty good. Yeah.
Okay. She is the editor of Our Traditional Media Dead? Can Journalism Survive in the Digital World? Author of the critically acclaimed The Nubian Wedding Book, Words and Rituals to Celebrate and Plan an African American Wedding, and the anthology Aunties. 35 writers celebrate their other mother. How fascinating. Ingrid graduated from City College of New York with a BA, Bachelor's in Art, and from New York University with a Master's in Journalism. Her academic research interests are social media, multimedia news, entrepreneurship, the Black press, the digital divide, and online education. If I wasn't looking forward to this, I'm looking even more excited to hear from you now, Ingrid. Thanks for speaking to the group. Over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. A couple of things have changed because I think that bio is a little old. I am a tenured professor at Howard University, and I'm also recently assistant chair in the Department of Media, Journalism, and Film. So we changed the department, and I've got a couple of promotions. So I want to, yeah, thank you. Let me share my presentation with you. Let's see.
And while Ingrid is doing that, I will request everyone else to just please mute their microphone so that we have no background noises.
Okay.
And that I will mute myself.
All right, I think this is the right one. Okay. Okay, so the title of my presentation, Tricked Again, How Black People Navigate Media, Government, and Medical Misinformation. And as I was thinking about this presentation, I was trying to figure out how to get started. And I thought about how we, as Black people, are washed with misinformation and also impacted by decades of inequality that magnify the effects of misinformation on the Black community. So in my preliminary research, so this is really new, I haven't really gone in depth to do the research yet, but certain things came up in the research that I've done. And one of them is, how can Black media messaging be used to counteract misinformation on social media? And how can the work of Black researchers fill the gap against misinformation in social media messages? So those are two things that I wanted to take a look at in the research. And I'm hoping that I can receive feedback after this presentation about some directions that some people might think would be worth pursuing. Okay, so just a general definition, disinformation versus misinformation. And I believe I got this from Dr. Carley. Disinformation, false information spread with the intent to mislead or control the narrative. Information factually incorrect, false innuendos, hoaxes, use of specious arguments, arguments that are logically false. Misinformation, false information, and I'm sure most of you already know this, spread without the intent to mislead. For example, early reporting of the statistics in disasters. Since the intent is difficult to assess, it's often in practice better to separate this from misinformation into operational categories such as inaccurate facts, estimates, errors of logic, hoaxes, etc. And this one I got also from the working group. The distinction between misinformation and disinformation is in the terms of the intent of the content creator. Misinformation is used as an umbrella term for content that is false or misleading regardless of creator intent. Two kinds of misinformation: blatantly false content, heavily biased, misleading coverage of events, and I wanted to propose another one, which is omission. So I have some examples. And so again, when I was thinking about what to talk about, the thing that came up to me was this whole celebration around Juneteenth. Now I'm from New York, and so I wasn't aware of Juneteenth, except I guess I learned about Juneteenth maybe 30 years ago. I was in Omaha, Nebraska, and we went to a Juneteenth celebration out there. And the thing about this celebration becoming so popular in this era and this time when we're dealing with a lot of social unrest is that, to me, this event smacked sorely of omission. So there were a lot of misinformation around this date in June 19th, 1865. Inaccurate facts, errors of logic, hoaxes, heavily biased, misleading coverage of events, but most importantly, omitting information. So you know that Juneteenth was on June 19th, 1865, the day when federal troops arrived in Texas to take control of the state and ensure that all enslaved people were freed. And slave owners had moved to Texas because it was considered a safe haven for slavery. And some enslavers withheld information until after the harvest season, omission. And so that December, slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment. So this event was all about a reaction to the omission of information around freedom. So in looking at misinformation, I think that there are three categories that I wanted to focus on that were important, that really had a lot to do with the issue of omission: government, medical, and media neglect. So we have incomplete reporting on Black issues through the media, chronic underreporting of Black achievement, whitewashed newsrooms, extremely biased information, and currently lack of documentation and media coverage of Black cases of COVID-19. Some of that is changing now, but for the last few months, we've been struggling to find information about what's happening to Black people in this pandemic. So Black people live with uncertainty because of systemic racism, which has led to the collateral damages from discriminatory public policy, housing, education, jobs. So they suffer from financial insecurities, health insecurities, news deserts, food deserts, and a general lack of trust in public and private institutions. And also they are bombarded with mixed messaging. So in looking at the media has a cultural misinformation. So in the media, the presentation in television, books, magazines, and social media, we have images of dangerous and hedonistic Blacks, Black men depicted as violent or threatening, and Black women depicted as drug addicts, irresponsible, and abusive mothers who spawn violence in their children. And so those are some of the images that keep reoccurring that have moved from print to television to social media. And one of the things that also was impactful, because it kind of amplified the problems with media, was the Kerner Report in 1968. And so it criticized mainstream journalism's role in perpetuating the unrest of the 1960s. If you look at that event and you look at what's happening today, you can see some parallels, except that we also have those messages amplified on social media. And the media was also back then faulted for failing to hire Americans to help provide a more accurate depiction of challenges faced by African Americans, and you still see that today. And then we also have the rise in fake news with social media, fabricated information that mimics news and media content in form, but not an organizational process or intent. So misinformation negatively impacts trust. So we have, for the media, skepticism about integrating professions in mass media, the hypocrisy of the media, which created additional barriers for Black graduates, and a disappointing state of diversity in the media. And you can look at the newsroom critics that are speaking out now in 2020. And also in the disappointing state of diversity in the media, that's something that was pointed out back in the Kerner report that I just mentioned. So there's been, and the state of the media with social media companies now involved in the dissemination of news and information, there are some reports that are asking the companies to report how diverse their newsrooms are, and a lot of the social media companies are refusing or neglecting to provide that information. So you really don't know what those newsrooms look like, except that you know that they're not very diverse. So there's been an uneven and uneasy progress made by news organizations to meet the needs of diverse audiences. And you see that in some of the articles recently about how this lack of diversity impacts the voices of the minority journalists who are working there. And you have the unwritten rules. Again, we're talking about omission, which tempers the voice of cultural perspectives and filters out minority journalists. And then we're going to look at the government. So the government has adopted racist images in some of their public policy. And we know that through some of the older policies that are still impacting us today, most prominently the criminal justice system and mass incarceration. The images are used to link crime to underclass culture, and some of this governmental information ignored Black activism in the 1960s and 70s that opposed that kind of crime that's routinely depicted on screen, or now we're talking about on the internet. And so then you also have medical, and you know that famous case of the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis, which was a 40-year study that chronicled the progression of the disease, where doctors withheld treatment from a group of poor Black men suffering from syphilis. So some of these men went 40 years without being treated. And so then we're talking about omission again. They were not informed that there was a treatment, that they could be treated successfully for syphilis, and a lot of them lived that way. And so today we're looking at the concern about Pence talking about an experimental anti-malarial drug being tested on patients in Detroit, which is a primarily Black city. So again, we have this omission and this treatment misinformation about what works and what doesn't work. So, and then we look at the pandemic of 1918, and we still see some of the same misinformation coming out. A belief that melanin in the skin protects Black people against the coronavirus. We know that was debunked several months ago, but when it first came out, social media played up the idea that COVID-19 was not, that Black people would not contract COVID-19 because of the melanin in their skin or some other reason that had to do with being Black. And so they did not need to take extra precautions. So early on, the actor Idris Elba tested positive, and he started warning people. And in Baltimore, city officials launched a public awareness campaign to debunk the myth. And so we also look at the 2016 election, right? And we all know that in that election, there was a lot of interference, and specifically the Troll Farm Internet Research Agency was really involved in interfering with the Black vote. And so they operated 133 accounts on Instagram, focused mostly on race, ethnicity, or forms of personal identity. In this case, Instagram was bigger than Facebook in sending out those misinformed messaging. And they targeted cultural issues and Black pride, but they weren't expressly political. So they talked about Black history, maybe Malcolm X, and the Black Panther Party, all things that were probably back, Malcolm X and the Black Panther Party from the late 70s. So they talked about those issues, which a lot of young people are interested in today. So they also had Black Matters US had accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Google+, Tumblr, and PayPal. And so that PayPal allowed them to solicit donations. And then they also had Blackstagram, which had more than 300 followers. And then on Facebook, Blacktivists garnered millions of likes, shares, and comments. And so these linking across platforms allowed them to have more impact. So they were able to organize real protests and rallies and a direct online traffic to a Russian website. So this Russian interference has been proven to be real. And we have this that shows you the how much Black people were targeted in that campaign by the IRA. And you can see that the Black community is the orange part of the circle. So so the Black presence on social media. So Nielsen says that African Americans among the top consumers of social media, especially when you look at presidential politics. And the Russian influences targeted African America on social media more than any other group in the 2016 election. And Facebook and Instagram were echo chambers for messages that said suppress the Black vote or manipulate the Black vote. So we know that this occurred. And we also know that there are bots and AI software that's run to play into existing concerns and stereotypes that amplify that message about the negative things having to do with Black people, and often Black people who are also victims of racism and also can use racist messages, spread messages that deal with racism just like everybody else, because they get tricked by the people, the players, and the trolls. So the other thing that you have to worry about is that in this messaging, the tech companies are clueless about what messages they should be amplifying because they are not familiar with the culture. So in fact, Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Pinterest modified the interfaces to give information to anyone searching for COVID-19 or coronavirus, trying to provide important medical recommendations. However, they weren't familiar with the Black culture, and so they often amplified negative messages and misinformation around COVID-19. For example, the Black communities were using different memes like Rona and remixing Cardi B's messages. And so the companies amplified some of these negative messages because they didn't understand the cultural conversation, and they often use that rather than official health-related data. So the question for African Americans and for the community at large is, how do you build trust or rebuild trust? And so there are some things I just wanted to take a look at, because there are some efforts among some organizations and some school-related efforts to kind of offer a trustworthy space for Black readers and Black news consumers to get information. And I wanted to point out this recent study that Howard University did, the Howard Initiative on Public Opinion. So they did a study, the impact of COVID on Black and Latinx communities. And there's some interesting things that come up that didn't come up in the general conversation. And we have to understand that much misinformation is because a lot of times the issues surrounding Black and minority communities are under-researched. For example, they noted that of 80 polls that are out about the coronavirus, only 80 polls that they looked at, only 10 focused on minorities, Black, Latinx, Native American, and few had sample sets of 1,500 or more. So in their set, they had 1,654 people surveyed, and you can get a sample of the people who were surveyed. So of them, let's see, 46% were African Americans, 33% were white, 17% were others. And the household income under 30,000, 40%, 24% were 30 and 59. So they had a good selection, a good diversity in this survey of people about the impact of COVID-19 on them. So the thing about it is that it also spoke to trust, and they had little trust in the government. And so you can see in particular, if you look at the African American category, so the first one, trust in the local government, 28% of African Americans would rely on their local government. And the number for the federal government is 31%, but still it's lower than the total non-white Latinx people. So trust in the government is low, but there's reasons for it, because the government has not always been trustworthy for this segment of the population. But we try to use distrust as a survival technique because we live with a high level of uncertainty. Black people have disproportionately gotten the COVID-19, and many are dying because of work. And so they understand that nobody's coming to save you, and they can't trust the federal government, but they might trust their local government. So there's a change in urgency in the message, according to the researchers in that study. And so they said the messaging changed once it was determined that Black people bore the brunt of it. So the old message was, oh no, you can't get it. And so the new message was, you have to return to work. And so you're saying that to the people who are always, who seem to be on the front lines. And so the people are seeking to reduce a level of uncertainty because they can't control the disease, they can't trust the government, and they can't control the economy. So, the recent findings, and this is interesting, from the CDC, found that 83% of Black people and 45% of others were impacted by the disease, according to this study. And so among them, the ages of the workers were 18 to 34 for Latinx and 18 to 64 for African Americans. So it's the CDC found that Black people were no more likely to be obese, have lung disease, or to be on the ventilator than any of the other people who contracted the COVID-19 disease. And there were twice the deaths because there were twice the number of the patients. And there were also a high number of patients because they tended to be frontline workers, medical technicians, pharmacists, public transportation workers. And so that, to me, kind of highlighted what we heard earlier on in the COVID-19 pandemic. We heard that these pre-existing ailments made the Black population more likely to contract COVID-19, when in essence, the CDC findings say it's more likely, they were more likely to contract the disease because they had to go to work. And this is even for mid to high income African Americans, because they still are the people who have to be in the office or have to report to the job. So in terms of creating trust, there are some things that have been created that I just want to talk a little bit about. So at Howard University, we created a Truth Be Told, a student fact-checking site, which looks at Black claims about Black people in the media. And so the site tries to debunk all kinds of stories that pop up in the media. Like, for example, one story that kept popping up that the students covered was, does $1 circulate in the Black community less than $1 in another community, or the Hispanic community or the Asian community? And what they found was that that was not true. And we had to debunk it. And so that's a fact check that still comes up, but we offer the information that tells people that there's no way that can be true because the government doesn't compile the data by race. And so then there's also Africa Check, which is really doing a lot around the COVID-19 pandemic, because they also are dealing with Black people who can't get the virus. And so they have on their site a debunking of that. And so they do a lot of that. And they do a lot of it country by country. So they have a nationwide, a continent-wide team that looks at issues locally in different parts of different African countries. And then I also located Color of Change, which is a research advocacy group. And what they're doing is a lot of research around the COVID-19, and they're looking at some of the data, and they're looking at some of the ways that Black people are being impacted to advocate that more resources needs to come their way. And so I looked at Color of Change, and they actually are one of the largest civil rights organization in the country now. I think their numbers of members are larger than the NAACP. However, they function mostly virtually. They're an online organization. They're not really an organization that might have an office, say, the way the NAACP has, but you can contribute, and they're having great impact in a lot of ways. And so then we also had the Black press. Now, the Black press has been under pressure for a number of years, but this COVID-19 has saw a resurgence in the way that they're going about the information and getting the information out to the public. So the Black press, and in some cases, it's kind of contradictory, but some of them have gotten grants from Facebook to help them kind of weather this storm of providing information to their audiences. And so I think that's a very interesting trend, that a lot of local news organizations are being partially funded by Facebook and Google, who are offering grants and other kinds of financial incentives to help these organizations not crumble. You know, we're not going to say thrive, because they're still struggling, but they're not crumbling the way they might have during this pandemic. And then we also have increased awareness among Black voters. In North Carolina, they realized that the trolls were impacting the votes. And so they, some of the people in Charlotte specifically started reaching out to inform voters and to provide digital media literacy training. This is also something that we do at Howard University. We provide digital media literacy training to all the incoming students, so that they're aware of the fact that the information that you read online is not always reliable and credible, and they learn how to find out what is and what isn't. So what's next? My research, I want to figure out how to develop reliable information for Black people. And I also want to find out how to include more diversity in the researchers. And that's the end of my presentation. I have plenty of references, and I'm open to any questions or any comments, and I thank you so much.